Okay, this is Chapter 2 for the American Government course. Here we just want to take a few minutes and talk about what is actually in the Constitution. Constitution being one of the most revered documents in human history that not that many people have actually read. Now, if you want to follow along with the website here that has the actual Constitution text, you can do that as well. You should have at least read the Constitution by now, according to the syllabus. So now we're going to go over it in a little bit more detail. Well, Article 1 is talking about the legislative branch, which talks about the powers of Congress, requirements for representatives, and things like that. Section 2, for example, talks about, as far as age requirements, citizenship requirements for being a member of the House of Representatives. The Senate, they also talk about one representative per of each districts there. We'll talk about that more later on. They also talk about in Section 2 and Section 3, House has the power to impeach the president, which means they have the power to file the charges or serve the indictment, so to speak. And then the trial for the impeachment would be held in the Senate. It's talked about in Section 3. So we're going to be talking about a few things here in the Constitution that will continue to come up throughout the course. Now, if you go to Section 4, this is an important delegation that the federal government is giving to the states. Remember, we talked about one of the motivations for the Constitutional Convention was to have a stronger central government, but they also kept it a federal system where they would have the state governments operating separately from the federal government. So this is something that the federal government, according to the Constitution, has delegated down to the states, and that's for holding elections. The time, places, manner of holding elections for the senators and representatives will be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. So therefore, every state has got its own setup. There's a lot of commonalities, of course. There's also the requirement that one representative will be elected per each district. We'll talk about how the states are divided up into districts in more detail later on. We've also talked about how each state will elect 2 senators. So the way that each state does that is according to their own setup. So that's an important delegation down to one of the few that's actually written in the Constitution, and then we'll talk about the Bill of Rights later on. Jumping ahead to Section 7, this is where they talk about when the president is given a bill, and if the president refuses to sign that bill, the Congress can override that veto with a 2/3 vote in both houses, which is pretty hard to do in today's polarized climate. It's very difficult to get 2/3 of congressmen to agree on anything. But it is part of the checks and balances that we'll be touching on throughout this course, that if it is a bill that's popular to the United States people and we have a stubborn president who doesn't want to sign it, well, it's possible Congress could override that veto and put it into law. Doesn't happen very often. Hasn't happened. Well, it only happened once in the Obama administration in 8 years. So we'll probably touch on some of those examples here and there. Probably one of the most important sections of the entire Constitution is Section 8 in Article 1, talking about the expressed powers of Congress. So let's just go ahead and look at that. Section 8, Congress have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, impose excises, pay the debts, provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. That's called the General Welfare Clause. It's an expressed power, but that's also pretty broad. So you can see some of the other powers that Congress has. Borrow money, very importantly, to regulate commerce. That was one of the things that the federal government under the Articles of Confederation could not do, and they were really hamstrung by that. Here's some other things that it can do as in charge of copyrights. Let's see. It can also, this is important, only Congress can declare war, and we'll talk about that more later on. These are some of the expressed powers in the Constitution given to the Congress, which of course the legislative branch has the power to make the laws, which makes it somewhat a little bit more predominant than the other two branches. At least that was the original intent. And then the last sentence here in Section 8 is also a very important one: to make all laws which are necessary and proper for carrying into execution. And this is what's called the Necessary and Proper Clause, which is an implied power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper. So those are a very important part of Article 1, talking about the legislative branch, Congress. Now, the Constitution does not guarantee very many individual rights, and that's one of the reasons why the Bill of Rights was promised to be added immediately. A couple of the things that the Constitution does grant or guarantee is what we call the right of habeas corpus, which you have probably heard. That literally translates from Latin as to have the body, provide the body, which means that people are given the right to go through the due process. If they're arrested, they have to be brought before court and faced with what they're charged with. You can't just throw somebody into a dungeon and forget about them. That's a very important right. Another one is the ex post facto law, which simply means that you can't pass a law after the fact. You can't catch somebody doing something that's legal, but you don't like it. So then you go pass a law and then go back and arrest them. Can't do that. Now, of course, after you pass the law and then they do it, then they're subject to the arrest, but you can't pass the law and then go back and arrest somebody. So these are just some very basic individual rights that are stated in the Constitution. In Section 10, about one of the biggest threats to our new country there under the Articles of Confederation is that the states were kind of looking at perhaps dealing with other countries on their own. And that could have been a death blow to the United States if for example, if Virginia had aligned with France and New York had aligned with England, just for example, yes, there could have been some serious conflict immediately between the states if that had occurred. So Section 10 is extremely important, that states that no state shall enter into any treaty. Also, what is called the Interstate Compact Clause is that states really can't go into agreements with each other unless that's approved by Congress. So again, that's just a safeguard against states, aligning together to perhaps rebel against the United States government. Again, that's been fairly unlikely throughout our history, except for the Civil War, which we'll talk about a little bit more detail later on. But the Interstate Compact Clause is to where if states want to come together and agree on something, well, they go through congressional approval. There's one that's very local to our area here, the New York, New Jersey Port Authority. That's an interstate compact where they have come together and created this authority that handles the bridge and tunnel traffic. When states are sharing rivers, for example, the states may have to come together and agree that they're going to get quality water. For example, a downstream state of the Colorado River, if the upstream state uses it all up and just leaves a trickle of sludge coming down to your state, well, that's not going to do. So the states will come together and have an agreement to make sure that enough quality water is remaining in the river as it goes downstream to the other states. Now, Article 2 is outlining the requirements and the powers of the executive branch, which is led by the president. He's called the chief executive. He is the boss of the executive branch, which implements or executes the laws that are given to it by Congress. Part of that separation of powers. Congress makes the laws and then they hand it over for the executive branch to implement that law out into the world and enforce it, regulate it, whatever is needed to be done. Now, the first thing they outlined in Article 2 was the method for electing the president, because as I mentioned, they were still concerned about a president becoming too powerful, and if he was elected by pure popular vote, then could potentially get a populist or a demagogue that could amass a lot of popular power and then perhaps take over the other branches. So what they wanted to do was filter the votes for the president through these electors in a similar manner that they did with the representative republic, where we elect our representatives through these districts and through the Senate. So we'll talk more about the Electoral College later because it is kind of complicated and controversial. We've had a few elections where the candidate that had more of the popular vote did not win the election because they did not have a majority of the electoral votes. And that occurred just in 2016 between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. So we'll talk about that in more detail. Right now, I just want to give you an overview of some of the things, the most important things for our class for now that are in the Constitution, some things that will probably come up throughout the course. Now, Section 2 talks about the powers of the president, first being that he's commander-in-chief. So in a democracy, we've established this norm of having the military be controlled by civilian leadership so that you have a little bit of checks and balances there, that military leaders may have other priorities that may bias them towards military conflict or whatever. But again, some of our best presidents have been former generals, so it's not that there's a concern in America. There are other countries where military dictatorships are in charge, and they've usually been pretty unstable. But the president is the commander-in-chief for a few reasons, primarily so that he will have the flexibility to act in an emergency. Of course, we've already talked about how Congress has the power to declare war, and the Congress has not declared war since World War II. Now, we'll talk about how we've gotten involved in some other wars despite that. There's logical reasons for that, even though they weren't intended to get that out of hand, you could say. But it's logical to have the president be ready and flexible, able to mobilize troops if there's a threat. He can't sit around and wait for Congress to make some sort of decision. He can perhaps take care of problems, or at least be on ready, or mobilize, or send help to our allies, things like that, that are fairly logical for the president to do. Now, as far as getting into war, that's a different ball game that we'll get into a little bit more later on. But the president is designated commander-in-chief. Constitution implies very strongly that the president is in charge of foreign policy. He is the face of the nation. He's the one that is going to be making the treaties with other countries. Obviously, he sends his delegates to iron out the details, but the president is the one that is tasked with making that treaty. Now, then it has to get approved by the Senate with a 2/3 vote. Because it's difficult for the Senate to find 2/3 of its membership to agree on anything, what presidents have been doing for the vast majority of time for the past several decades is making what we call these executive agreements. And we'll talk about those more in detail later, because those things are part of what's given the United States president more power than perhaps what was intended by the framers when they wrote this. So the president has picked up more power than what may have been intended. And so we'll get into that more later. Let's talk first of all about what was the original powers granted in the Constitution. Also has the power to appoint ambassadors, federal judges, all the heads of the departments in the executive branch. So that's a lot of people. A new president coming in, particularly with a new party, will probably appoint at least 1,000 department heads and judges and ambassadors during the course of his first term. Of course, these also have to be approved by the Senate, just by a majority vote. Now, in Section 3, it actually states that the president will give a State of the Union in front of Congress. That's typically at the beginning of each new session, but the president typically does that at the first of every year, even though Congress has a new session every 2 years. We'll get into that in more detail later on. House of Representatives are up for election every 2 years, and the senators are up for election every 6 years, but they are staggered so that 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election every 2 years. So that means we have a brand new Congress every 2 years. The president, since he's the only person that's elected by all of the people of the United States, he's the face of the nation. Considerable more publicity for him or her to be elected. So therefore, the president can then step in to the new office there and says, okay, this is what the American people elected me to do. So I'm setting the agenda. So the State of the Union is where he lays that out for Congress. The American people elected me to do this. So Congress, get to it. Start doing these things, making these laws, making these changes, whatever it is, and I'll sign them into law. Part of the separation of powers there. The president can't actually make the laws, but he does have a lot of influence in setting the agenda. And then, of course, we'll talk about the very involved process to get bills passed anyway, which has to have lots of different inputs. And, of course, the president's branch, the executive branch, will actually be taking that new law and then running with it, implementing it, enforcing it out into society. The executive branch, as you can imagine, is tasked, the president is tasked with faithfully executing the laws that have been passed by Congress. Article 3 is fairly short and sweet, talking about the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, and the so-called inferior courts below that. We'll talk about that structure in more detail later on. But you have the Circuit Court of Appeals right below the Supreme Court. There's 13 of those spread out all over the country. And then the district courts, which there's about 94 of federal district courts that are spread out all over the United States. That's the federal judicial branch. Literally, the federal court system was to be set up by Congress. And that's one of the very first things that the new Congress did in 1789 was the Judiciary Act, which set up the original Supreme Court, the original circuit courts, the original district courts, and it's evolved since then through numerous other acts of Congress. Framers of the Constitution decided that federal judges would be appointed for life. This is called in terms of good behavior. So as long as the judges behave themselves, I guess you could say, they have that job for life. We'll get into that more later on. The primary goal for that was to insulate the judges from the election process, because in order to get elected, you have to raise money, you have to make a lot of promises, you have to declare, at least in today's world, you have to declare a party membership. And so that would potentially make judges a little bit more beholden to certain things. There's several states that elect their judges, and there doesn't seem to be an issue with that. But on the federal level, they wanted to not deal with that. So federal judges are appointed, and they're there for life. Article 3 talks about the federal courts have jurisdiction on anything that deals with the Constitution, federal laws, and treaties. And another very important delegation in Article 3, the trial of all crimes shall be by jury, and such trial shall be held in the state where the crimes have been committed. One of the reasons why the overwhelming majority of trials in America are held in state courts where that crime is committed. So that is another very important delegation down to the states where trials for crimes will be held in the state court system. That's why there's a variation between states. There's lots of commonalities, but there are variations between states. But each state has its own separate responsibility to handle the crimes that are committed in that state. So that's a very important aspect of our federal system. Article 4 is the unity article, where they wanted to make sure that all the states were together on the same page. The full faith and credit clause and privileges and immunities clause simply means that if there are important acts, documents, proceedings that are granted to someone in one state, that the other states are obligated to acknowledge those. Of course, now there's a lot of variation on that. There are certain licensing requirements that states take on themselves. For example, if I wanted to be a licensed professional engineer, since I used to be an engineer and I'm still licensed in Texas, well, if I wanted to practice engineering in New Jersey, I would actually have to get licensed in New Jersey. I could not be an official engineer that would be able to sign and seal my own drawings in New Jersey unless I was registered in New Jersey. And there's lots of professions that kind of work like that. So there's clearly some exceptions to this, but same-sex marriage issue also somewhat dealing with this, that if a state recognized a gay couple to be married in their state, you could perhaps argue that another state would have to recognize them being married, but many states did not. Now, the big hiccup on that, of course, was that the federal government did not acknowledge gay marriage. So that had to be addressed first. And then once they struck down the federal recognition of marriage being between a man and a woman, then that opened the door to legalizing same-sex marriage nationwide. Extradition, which means that criminals that flee from one state to the next have to be brought back to the state where that crime was committed. So that's in the Constitution, that states are required to do that. There is one small exception, that if that fugitive commits a crime in that new state, well, that new state could say, well, wait a minute, we're going to try this person first, and then after we try this person, then you can have him. So there are certain things, technicalities there. This particular article also referred to slaves. Now, even though the word slaves or slavery was never mentioned once in the Constitution, it was alluded to a couple of times, particularly when they mention people held in labor or service. And that part of that article there also required people held in service or labor to be brought back as well. Now, that, of course, was changed in the 13th Amendment. The Article 4 also talks about admission of new states, because that was somewhat of a controversy, but fairly simple process, how it's stated in the Constitution. But the Western territories gradually were able to become states, and this led to our expansion all the way to the West Coast of the United States, being one of the biggest states in the world. Another guarantee, since there's not a whole lot of individual rights guaranteed in the Constitution, one of them was in Article 4, that the Constitution guarantees a republican form of government, and that does not mean the Republican Party. That means a representative form of government. Article 5 is just simply the process for making amendments, and even though there's 4 different ways that you could actually amend the Constitution, only one way has been used, and that's 2/3 vote in both houses of Congress, and then it goes out, and then 3/4 of all the states' legislatures approve that. It's a very deliberative process. The framers intentionally wanted this to be difficult. They did not want the Constitution to be able to change easily or on a whim or on some populist idea. And since 1791, there's only been 17 amendments to the Constitution, but there's been several thousand attempts to change the Constitution. So this gives you an idea how difficult and deliberative that process is by intent. Article 6, very important supremacy clause to make it very clear that we are a United States and that the Constitution, federal laws, and treaties shall be the supreme law of the land. Now, as we'll talk about with the Bill of Rights, the federal government delegates a lot for the states to take care of. But if there's an issue and it goes up through the courts, the federal government will have final say. They also wanted to make all debts valid, as I said before, under Hamilton's original plan, wanted the federal government to be a credible foundation of our economic system and that would pay its debts. As for ratification, that would just very short, briefly outlining that ratification conventions would be required for all the states. Approval of 9 states was required to put the Constitution into play, and it occurred relatively quickly as far as compared to today's times where years go by and nothing gets done. They submitted the Constitution in September of 1787, and 9 states ratified it by the following June of 1788. And then the first elections were held immediately thereafter. It happened pretty quick, and you could certainly argue that if it had not have happened, the United States might not be here today. It was very important for them to get all the United States united and on the same page as far as the foundation of the rule of law was concerned. Here is just a table that outlines some of the things that we've just talked about. We will be referring to the Constitution quite often throughout this course. In the next section, we'll talk about what was done to try to sell the Constitution to get it ratified, and that includes the Federalist Papers and, of course, the Bill of Rights, which we'll talk about in more detail in the next section.